And so when we think about gas exchange or the physiology associated with the respiratory tract, this is one of the main functions that we have to consider. And so there's some terminology that's really important to understand when we talk about gas exchange. And so the first term that's important to understand is that of ventilation. And so that's just the general movement of air in and out of the lungs. And we can get what we call ventilation mismatches with different types of pathologic conditions, so that that movement of air doesn't correspond as well to the oxygenation process. Moving further down, then we have perfusion, which is that movement and distribution of blood through the pulmonary circulation. And so in this case, this is where that gas exchange is starting to occur. And there's a lot of different disease processes that can inhibit some of the perfusion functions. One of the common ones that we see that has more of an idiopathic presentation for most people is a pulmonary hypertension. So that directly has to do with the arteries of the lungs, and you get that increasing pressures, which then inhibits the perfusion capacities of those lungs. And then finally, we have diffusion. And so within the alveoli, we get that movement of the oxygen and carbon dioxide across that air-blood barrier and across those capillary membranes. And we do have different types of disease processes that can affect diffusion, one of the most common ones being COPD. In addition to the different gases exchanges for ventilation, perfusion, and diffusion, we can also see the oxyhemoglobin dissociation as far as how well does the hemoglobin bind to the oxygen, and then how well does the oxygen release from the hemoglobin. And we'll talk about that more in depth when we look at the lab and diagnostic tests. Anytime you have any mismatches with the ventilation, perfusion, or diffusion, there is then the potential that the patient will need some oxygen therapy, because it's very important that we maintain a certain level of oxygenation, because we don't want the person to become hypoxic, which then can lead to permanent damage. And so with oxygen therapy, this is a treatment which increases the concentration of oxygen available to the patient for breathing, and this either can be delivered through a nasal cannula, a tent-like structures, chambers, or your traditional oxygen mask. Another physiological function of the lungs is acid-base balance. And so the lungs help to regulate carbon dioxide, which is considered an acid within our bodies. And when we look at either respiratory acidosis or respiratory alkalosis, you have to kind of think about what's going on in the body to cause those conditions. And so in respiratory alkalosis, where we're seeing that increase in the pH, initially the response in this case is typically due, if it's a respiratory problem, it's going to be due to hyperventilation, or the patient actually blowing off too much of the carbon dioxide, and so that decreases that acid component in the body.